Max Verstappen survives a very late scare to claim victory at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. The Dutchman matches Michael Schumacher's record for claiming 3 consecutive victories at Imola. From RacingNews365.com, my name is Nick Golding and I'm joined as always by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, for 90% of the race, it was a typically dominant Max Verstappen display, only for Lando Norris to find some extraordinary pace in the closing laps.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how many fans switched off after the opening few laps, because this was typical Imola. We were hoping for a really good race. We enthused about the upgrades on the McLaren. We enthused about the upgrades on Ferrari. I said that those packages on those cars, they looked like they were going to deliver good race pace. And for the most part, they didn't until, as you mentioned, those closing laps when Lando Norris all of a sudden managed to find something out of that car, something on those tyres. Max was radioing saying his tyres were dead. Lovely exchanges with his engineer Giampiero Lambiase towards the end there. And he reeled him in. I think it was about an 8-second gap. And all of a sudden you just suddenly started to see this gap coming down. 0.5 seconds, 0.8 seconds, 0.9 seconds per lap. And then within about the last 3-4 laps, Max just managed to hold it to a certain extent, about 1.5 seconds. And that was just enough to prevent Lando getting close enough, although he finished at 3/4 of a second adrift at the end on that final lap, after that final lap. And it just wasn't quite enough. Point to mention as well with regard to Max, he was given 3 black and white flags for exceeding track limits. And at any point, if it had done that again with Lando right behind him, he was coming under severe pressure. So fair play to Max with what he managed to achieve there, because, as I say, 1 more black and white flag, and that could have changed the whole perspective of the ending of that Grand Prix. And Lando might have got back-to-back Grand Prix wins after what he achieved in Miami, of course. Yeah, it was a shame about the majority of that race. It was typical Imola. Fernando Alonso said it at the end of the day after qualifying on Saturday that Imola is the second hardest track on which to overtake, and boy was that proven to be the case. Monaco being the hardest, of course, and we got that one coming up next.
The thing with Max as well, it was the defence of a world champion, because when you look at Perez, who was down in 8th, Red Bull didn't have it all their own way this weekend. McLaren and Lando Norris were right there. But the thing that was really interesting with Lando is that prior to suddenly closing in on Max in the latter stages, he came under massive pressure himself from Charles Leclerc, because Leclerc looked like he was going to have the pace to pip Lando for second, only for Lando to pull out some immense pace.
That was just the tyres going off. If you think about it, that happened quite often with those front runners, as we saw. We saw Oscar trying to attack Carlos at the start and got close, was constantly in DRS, couldn't make a move in any way, and eventually you saw him just drift a little bit back off Carlos, simply because the tyres had gone. He was trying so hard to get past. After that first pit stop window, we then saw Oscar closing on the back of Charles Leclerc. And again, very similar thing, managed to get really close, got within DRS on a couple of occasions, couldn't get close enough to make a move, and had to drop back. And then, as you say, Charles then closing in Orlando, and there was a possibility with Charles Leclerc going to have an opportunity to finish runner-up, or even pressure Max if he'd managed to have got past Lando. And again, we saw the tyres just dropped off. That's just what happens with the nature of this track. It is Imola, and very unfortunately, as I said at the very start, we did not quite get the race that we were truly hoping for.
Well, Leclerc did at least get P3, which, based on the scenes at the end, the Tifosi still seems pretty happy with that. Do you think Ferrari, though, would be a bit disappointed to have only come home in 3rd and 5th?
Absolutely, simply because, as Fred Vasseur mentioned in his post-race debrief with the media, that they were hoping for so much more from qualifying, quite basically. At this track, as I mentioned, position is everything on the grid. It's going to be the same in Monaco. And they didn't get the positions that they wanted. They didn't get the maximum out of the package that they'd been hoping for. As Carlos Sainz pointed out, the media, blame us folks, we perhaps overestimated what might be coming from that upgrade that Ferrari delivered on that car this weekend. But that's the landscape in which we live in at the minute. We are hoping so much from that outside looking in perspective that Red Bull and Max are going to be challenged to a greater degree than they have at any time over the past 2 years when Red Bull and Max have walked away with the titles. We are seeing signs, though, that certainly from McLaren over these past 2 Grand Prix, with what has been delivered on that car in terms of the upgrade package, there were certainly signs from Ferrari at various times over this Grand Prix weekend with what they've put on that car, that there is now this convergence towards the front. And I asked Christian Horner, and I'll make this point very briefly, that are we now seeing, with what McLaren has done in the past 2 Grand Prix, what Ferrari has delivered, and we expect there's more to come, is there going to be more of a title race than we've seen over the past couple of years? Christian certainly didn't dismiss that in any way, shape or form. Fred Vasseur suggested as such that there is more to come from this championship. He certainly believes Ferrari will be pressuring Red Bull and McLaren to a greater degree than they did this weekend. And believe this if you want, folks, because we've had so many false dawns with Mercedes. Toto Wolff is absolutely convinced that right now his team is on the right trajectory. As I said, he said that many times in the past 2 years with regard to what they had on that car, and it never really materialized. Now, and with what they're seeing in terms of development in the wind tunnel, this is not going to be, and I'll use the phrase again, that false dawn that we've seen in the past from Mercedes. Don't expect it to be too soon. Perhaps as we get closer towards the summer break, then they could be in that mix at the front of the grid again. But there is certainly belief within Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton has mentioned it as well, that they are going to be challenging towards the front. Not too soon, as I say, but certainly somewhere, maybe 3 or 4 months' time, let's say.
On the topic of Mercedes, obviously Hamilton got 6th with Russell in 7th. But weirdly, Russell was obviously ahead of Hamilton for pretty much the entire race. However, what was a one-stop race for the vast majority of the field, Mercedes decided to pit Russell for a second time in their closing laps, dropping him behind Hamilton. And obviously, whilst Russell got the fastest lap, he then finished behind Lewis. It was a bit of a weird situation, given that actually Russell was now finished behind Hamilton.
It was just one of those where, as you said, they just decided to go for the fastest lap point at the end of the day. Points-wise, does it really make any difference? Because not really. So it was just a roll of the dice that they decided to play at that particular stage. Why not? Let's get a bit more evaluation over those closing laps with regard to what Russell did, rather than just leaving him to just effectively trundle round. He had already mentioned as well, of course, that his tyres were going off.
Yeah.
So there was no gamble involved. Checo was too far back to have any effect on the finishing order between Lewis and George. He got as far as he could go in moving up to 8th position. And after having made his stop, eventually he went long on his tyres, the hard tyres. Started on the hard. Top 10 all started on brand new mediums. He went long. We saw some overtakes throughout that Grand Prix, but it was really on a fading. Yeah, there were some, but it was on a fading Checo effectively. Yeah. After bearing in mind the medium tyre starters had then switched to the hard, and they just reeled him in. So yes, there were some passes, but to all intents and purposes, they weren't really, hard, fast racing passes, were they? They were just the natural order of things, given the tyres going off on Checo's car. So for Mercedes, as I say, nothing really to lose. Why not? They got George the fastest lap point, even if he did ultimately finish behind Lewis.
And just very quickly, obviously, to go through the top 10 from today, Max Verstappen was victorious ahead of Lando, Norris and Charles Leclerc. Oscar Piastri in a solid P4, given that he was penalised and dropped to 5th in qualifying. Carlos Sainz in 5th. We just mentioned there, Mercedes, Hamilton in 6th, Russell in 7th, Sergio Perez in 8th, ahead of Lance Stroll in a solid job for Aston Martin in P9, considering Alonso was down in P19. And then Yuki Tsunoda does the job for RB, once again in P10. A final driver we do need to mention is Alex Albon. Obviously, ahead of this weekend, signed his new multi-year contract. was that only a retiree was slapped with a 10-second time penalty during the race for an unsafe release due to his front right tyre not quite being on correctly, and was then investigated again for allegedly leaving the pit lane knowing that there was an issue with the car. Of course, that was actually dropped and he wasn't given a second penalty, but on a weekend of celebration for Albon and Williams with the new contract, it was one of a nightmare, it's fair to say.
Effectively, that's probably a good word to use, actually. As you say, came into this weekend on such a high, brand new multi-year deal in his pocket, knowing he's safe for when the new regulations kick in 2026, and really believing in what this team is going to be able to do over the coming years. And then, as you say, he suffers that kind of weekend. It's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes, isn't it, to use that kind of phrase? Just one of those things, isn't it? At least he's got the next weekend coming up to try and put this one behind him very quickly. But it is Monaco, and I don't see Williams doing great things around that track, to be honest, bearing in mind what we've seen this weekend. As I say, Nick, just one of those weekends for him. He'll fly away from here, get it out of his system, quickly forgotten, just move on to the next one as soon as possible.
Now, we do need to give a special mention to Racing News 365's Fergal Walsh, who correctly predicted the top three. His bold prediction was actually correct, which, takes the mickey out of us too. Well, it wasn't that bold, but he was correct, and that's the most important thing, because 9 times out of 10, as those will have seen from particularly my bold predictions last night, they normally go horribly wrong. But Ian, just to quickly round things off, obviously, Imola last season was cancelled due to the horrific flooding, and obviously there was a tragic loss of life. How good was it for F1 to be back in Imola this weekend?
I think on a couple of fronts, Nick, we have to also remember that this was a weekend to reflect on the careers of Senna and Roland Ratzenberger, of course, who lost their lives 30 years ago at this circuit. And it's been a memorable weekend in many respects, not only, as you say, reflecting on the people that lost their lives with regard to the flooding last year, but also with regard to Senna and Ratzenberger. Lots of tributes that have taken place over the course of the weekend. None better than I have to say than seeing the sight of Sebastian Vettel take Ayrton's McLaren MP44 round the circuit on a couple of laps, wearing the Senna overalls, even going so far as to, on that warm down lap, taking the Brazilian flag and flying that, just as Ayrton used to do in memorable victories throughout his career. And of course, a nod from Seb to Roland Ratzenberger as well, of course, because he also had the Austrian flag there as well as he did that. Tremendous words from Seb when he spoke afterwards about that achievement. He described it as, and I'll just remember this correctly, he described it as one of the most emotional moments he has ever experienced in his entire motorsport career. When you think what he's achieved over that motorsport career as well, to say something like that on this particular weekend of all weekends, on this 30th anniversary weekend, to then do what he did with the tribute helmet, with the overalls, in that very iconic McLaren car, to then step out of the cockpit and say, I've got a tear in my eye, that was his words, he did have a tear in his eye when he stepped out of that cockpit. And you could see as well as he was being interviewed on the grid by Formula One TV. And when we spoke to him as well, there was a little bit of a lump in his throat as he was trying to reflect on what he had basically just done. Because it was his concept idea. He approached the Senna family about it. Of course, it was one of those opportunities to never forget that particular weekend, which of course was in many respects a turning point for Formula One with regards to its crusade for safety. And much has been achieved onwards from that particular weekend. And very sadly, yes, of course, it took two racing drivers, one of the greatest of all time, to lend itself to that. But that is part of their legacy that we are still able to remember to this day, that Formula One has moved on in such a considerable way with regards to its safety.
Now, the scenes were beautiful, and to those who are watching, I do highly recommend going on YouTube or social media and finding the footage of Vettel's demo laps, because it was something very special. For those who have been watching our videos the last weekend, it's also important to say thank you to you, because our views on Saturday in particular were extraordinary, and it's amazing to see so many positive conversations in the comment section. Please, we want to see the same after every video, and be sure as well to put your comments in the section below. For the podcast that's coming up on Monday, from myself and Ian will be in Monaco, of course. We will see you next time from Race News 365. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. See you later.
Just a word on what Nick's just mentioned as well there, folks. Yeah, thank you ever so much from myself here as well, attending these Grand Prix, hopefully giving you as much information as I possibly can. If there's anything you want to discuss, any questions that you have that we can bring up in podcasts or future F1 updates, I'm going to be in Monaco. Can't wait for that one. Going to have some spectacular scenery behind me for that, I promise. So please keep those great conversations rolling in. Keep your great questions rolling in as well. It's all part of what we love doing on this show, Nick and I, and with our podcast on Monday when Sam Coop joins us as well. So yeah, great stuff from you guys. We love it. That's what we're here for. Keep it going. Take care now, folks.
See you later.